Good afternoon, everybody. Let's start. Well, today I've been given an impossible task. Impossible because I've been asked to introduce Professor Jeff Sachs in 5 minutes. This person has done so much that have affected so many people in the millions that it is truly difficult to introduce him and summarize all that he has done. Professor Sachs is a famous, influential economist. His academic work has focused on issues that have to do with economic growth, sustainable growth, economic stability, and fighting against poverty and hunger. On these issues, he has published numerous academic papers, both theoretical and empirical, and it is his empirical work that I find most influential. He's an advisor on these issues, senior advisor to the United Nations, and he's a renowned leader for sustainable development. He has advised dozens of countries on issues of sustainable development, economic growth, hunger, and poverty. And he has traveled all over the world, covering 90% of the world's population, trying to promote sustainable development. He has been named in various occasions as one or the most known economist of his time, the most influential one, the most important one. Lately, in 2015, he has received the Blue Planet Prize, together with Professor Partha Dasgupta, and this is the most important global prize for sustainable leadership. It all started in Harvard when he received, where he received his PhD in economics, and then he became a professor there, a full professor at the age of 28, which is impressive on its own right. And then after 20 years in Harvard, he moved to Columbia University, where he's the Kedelec Professor for Sustainable Development and a professor in health policy and management. And for 14 years, he has directed the Earth Institute of Columbia University. He has advised, he's a special advisor and has been a special advisor to UN secretaries, starting from Kofi Annan to Ban Ki-moon and the current General Secretary. In particular, he has been advising on the Millennium Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals. He is now the director of the Center for Sustainable Development and the global director of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And this is the reason he is in Greece. I am very happy to communicate to you that we are launching the Greek Hub for Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a global network aiming at mobilizing the academic and research community in order to provide solutions, technological solutions, for the implementation of sustainable development. And we are trying to bring together not only the researchers from the different disciplines, but also the civil society, politics, and of course, businessmen. So I am extremely happy to introduce at this important event, the Open Science Fair, Professor Jeff Sachs. He will be speaking about the relationship and the interaction between open access, open science, open minds, and our ability to implement sustainable development. Thank you for inviting me to introduce him. Thank you for inviting him. Thanks to the National Library of Greece, who's been co-hosting this event, together with Open Science Fair. And I've been told to communicate that we also have a Sky TV channel covering the event. So on this note, I know that you don't want to hear me, you want to hear Professor Sachs. I ask Professor Sachs to come to the floor.
That was a little bit over the top, thank you. I'm very grateful, very, very kind. And I think everyone here would agree, could we be in a more beautiful and appropriate place imaginable than where we are right now? The building is gorgeous. We have the Acropolis looking over our shoulders, so we can imagine that Aristotle is judging our conference. And Pericles is wondering how we're going to do, and we have the Mediterranean over on our other shoulder, and it's a gorgeous day also, so it's really very, very special to be with you. And I'm tremendously happy about the initiative on open science. I'm going to give some reflections on it from my perspective. I will not call them comprehensive, but how I see your topic intersecting with the challenge that I'm trying to help pursue, and that is mobilizing science for sustainable development and mobilizing the knowledge that we have to solve problems like climate change, extreme poverty, disease burden, and other problems of sustainable development. You probably feel the way that I feel. Every week, nature and science arrives for me, and that is always an amazing, wondrous event, because pretty much every week you feel the whole world is opening up with incredible new insights and scientific knowledge. I think we're in a golden age of science. Of course, we're also in the age of idiocy in politics, so it's quite a contrast. So we watch both spans, the most ignorant president we ever had in the United States, combined with the most wonderful science that we can imagine, and somehow you're trying to figure out a way to make this work. In the United States, the last week has been completely consumed, almost completely consumed with the hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, Hurricane Harvey, which caused something more than $150 billion of damage, which is actually quite a bit even for a macroeconomist for 1 week's work. And no sooner did we turn around from that, the rain stopped. Now we have a Category 5 hurricane, Hurricane Irma, making landfall in the Caribbean right now. And in this week's Nature, or the one that arrived in my home just as I was going to the airport, there were several articles about new insights of disaster frequency, attribution science, risk analysis, all the topics that are remarkably important now for our survival in the face of the climate change that's underway. But just to keep with the motif, as soon as Hurricane Harvey hit, I did a quick online search because I wasn't really following Houston too intensively. But I looked up Houston hurricanes and flooding, and of course there were a vast number of articles in 2014, 2015, and 2016 that all had the same theme. It's not if, but when there will be a mega disaster. And there was already a tremendous amount of knowledge and foreseeability of the risks of massive flooding. The sea level had increased, the storm intensities in the Gulf of Mexico had increased. Of course, the water vapor in the atmosphere with the warmer temperatures had increased for more precipitation. And so there was already a pretty good feel that there was a very serious risk of a low-lying coastal region like the Houston metropolitan area, that it could be massively flooded. And all of these articles recounted the same thing, that what had been done in the face of all of this knowledge was nothing, precisely nothing. So despite all of the warnings of engineers and so on, the state of Texas is led by politicians who are climate deniers, and the governor, who really strikes me as a particular idiot, had spent most of his career suing the Environmental Protection Agency to get it to stop bothering Texas, which after all is home to our petrochemical industry and our oil and gas industry. And so the Texas politicians don't want to be bothered by anything like climate science or risk analysis, because that could jeopardize the campaign contributions as well. So this is the very, and because Trump trumps everything, 2 weeks before the flood, he had issued an executive order that had struck out an executive order of President Obama, which had instructed the US government to take into account the climate science in planning for the resilience of infrastructure. So literally 2 weeks before Hurricane Harvey, President Trump tried to eliminate the role of scientific knowledge in climate preparedness. And here, I don't think it's ever going to happen, because this guy is really a weird guy. And fortunately or not, his attention span is about 10 minutes. But he has proposed to have an infrastructure program of $1 trillion, but he wants to do it without scientific knowledge. So maybe we can all build it in floodplains and in hurricane zones and make sure that it never works at all if he were to have his way. That's our reality. Our reality is a remarkable era of scientific advance. It's, by some metrics, unprecedented because of the scale of global science, because of the breathtaking breakthroughs in many disciplines, usually related to information in some way, to the information technology breakthroughs in genomics or in nanotechnology or in computation and machine learning or in other areas. We're in the middle of, or in big data and the capacities to learn from big data. And so advances that are absolutely breathtaking, and then a kind of idiocy and recklessness in our politics. And our challenge is to find ways to bridge that. And that's what I spend most of my time doing. I'm an economist, not a scientist, but I like scientists. And I believe that the major role that economists can play, who basically we can do multiplication and division, we can do costs and benefits. The main challenge that I try to do is to bring the potential and the knowledge of science and technology breakthroughs to the awareness of public officials and to the UN agencies so that we can speed the application of these breakthroughs in knowledge to solving problems. And we are actually, despite everything of politics, solving some very important problems in recent years. One of the joys that I saw during the 15 years of the Millennium Development Goals, which were the UN's goals between 2000 and 2015 to fight extreme poverty, was the ability to use many scientific breakthroughs. For example, new medicines against malaria, new antigen tests that could replace laboratory testing or microscopy and could be done at a household for a few cents per test to control malaria, which is a massive killer disease, and where the deaths have come down by probably about 700,000 deaths per year, reduced now compared to a decade ago because of the advances of technology. We also have remarkable advances in the fight against AIDS, which is an ongoing epidemic now reaching 100 years of existence, as best we can tell from the molecular clock, but at least 40 years of known epidemic. And because of breakthroughs in drug treatment, in testing, diagnostics, epidemiology, modeling, now there are actually realistic prospects for bringing the AIDS epidemic to an ultimate conclusion, bringing the deaths down to near zero and breaking transmission. And this is something made possible by science just in the last few years. So my main message to policymakers in general is be aware of what is in those issues of nature and science each week, because they're not read by the policy community. And if they were, there could be a really remarkable breakthrough. The gaps between what is known or knowable in our problem solving and what is actually applied to the human condition is incredibly vast and in a way inexplicable when you have all of that good capacity and knowledge at hand, and we simply have a very, very difficult time of making it work. One of my guru scientists, my favorite gurus, E.O. Wilson, the biologist at Harvard, uses the expression that we have stumbled into the 21st century with our Stone Age emotions, our medieval institutions, and our near godlike technology. And I think that this is a good summary of where we are. We don't advance emotionally because we are still based on the emotional apparatus of the savanna, African savanna of probably 50,000 years ago. Our institutions are somewhere between 1,000 years and 200 years old and a little bit creaky, and our technology is making breathtaking breakthroughs week by week, and I think at an accelerating stride. And so this is the fate that we need to grapple with. Let me put two themes before you briefly. One is science for sustainable development, and the second is your theme, open science, and talk briefly about each one of these. Sustainable development is the governing concept in principle for global cooperation. It's an idea that was introduced 30 years ago this year by the famous Brundtland Commission that was chaired by then Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Brundtland. And it was proposed as a basic standard which says that the present generation should meet its needs in a way that will permit future generations to meet their needs. So it was stated as a kind of intergenerational mandate or justice. It was adopted by the world community in 1992, 25 years ago, as the standard for global cooperation in economy and environment. And by then, it had already begun to change its definition a bit to one that I find a little bit more understandable and applicable, and that is that sustainable development means achieving economic well-being in a way that is socially fair, equitable, and environmentally sustainable. So the challenge is, how can we make a world economy that combines prosperity, fairness, and sustainability? And 25 years ago, this was adopted as the basic standard at the Earth Summit. But 25 years later, we can say the challenge remains unmet. We have not yet changed our global politics or our processes or our institutions to combine prosperity, fairness, and sustainability. As an economist, my argument is that the first of these, the prosperity part, is the easiest part in a way, because actually the world economy is already very rich on average, unprecedentedly rich. We have a world economy that is calculated by the IMF, for example, the International Monetary Fund, to be an annual output of $125 trillion, measured in a certain kind of pricing, but about $125 trillion of annual output for 7.5 billion people. And this means that we are at approximately $17,000 per person, average output on the planet. So from a prosperity point of view, we made it, except for the fact that there are still 1 billion people struggling for daily survival because they're living at a few $100s per person per year consumption. And then there are, by the latest count, 2,034 billionaires in the world who have a combined net worth amongst themselves of $7.7 trillion, which is not bad for 2,000 people. So they have an average of roughly $3.5 billion each. And so we've created a kind of prosperous global economy, but by far not an equitable one. And the inequities have become more dangerous and more clear in many places in the world over the last 25 years since this goal was adopted. And in the United States, I live in Manhattan, and Manhattan is a place where you have the richest district of the United States right next to the poorest district. You have the Upper East Side of Manhattan filled with billionaires, and then you have East Harlem just north of it, which is one of the poorest places in the world. So it's very, very vivid, this kind of divide. And in the United States, the gaps of wealth and poverty have grown alarmingly over the last 25 years. And Trump's demagoguery got him elected as a tribune for the poor, but of course he's a creepy tool for the rich. So it's a complete fraud. And it's taking a while for this to come out, but at least a solid 60% of the public gets it now, and that number will continue to grow because it is a kind of fraud that he pulled off. But the other challenge that is equally dramatic is the environmental challenge. 25 years ago, the world agreed that we had a major crisis on climate change, a major crisis on the loss of biodiversity, and a major crisis on the spread of land degradation and desertification. So 3 big environmental treaties were agreed in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, the spread of deserts or land degradation. And those are 3 wonderful treaties, and not one of them has been implemented over the past 25 years. So we even reached the stage of international law and annual meetings and conferences of the parties and many proposals and proclamations, but by every objective standard, the situation is far worse today, 25 years on, than it was in 1992. The greenhouse gas emission concentrations have risen substantially. The temperatures have increased. The climate models, as they become more and more resolved, have shown increasing climate sensitivity over time and greater dangers. The warnings of massive nonlinear responses to climatology have grown. The awareness, for example, that we are vulnerable to a several meter rise of sea level, even on a century scale, is something that wasn't appreciated 25 years ago, but is now understood. On biodiversity, the accelerated loss of species is more and more apparent, and the destruction of land is pervasive, especially in the high biodiversity tropics, especially the rainforest biodiversity hotspots. And you look at a country like Brazil, home to most of the Amazon, where the Congress, which is represented by large landowners, or represents large landowners, just voted to relax the standards on Amazon development, and the president, who is himself a very corrupt politician, signed this into law as a deal with the large landowners so that the president could stay in power despite all of the growing evidence of his personal corrupt activities. So it's not a pretty picture. I spend a lot of time in Southeast Asia, where you fear that Indonesia and Malaysia will be completely clear-cut for growing palm oil, because on a market basis, it would be totally profitable to eliminate all the remaining rainforest and grow palm oil, because the world demand is sufficiently high for that to be market profitable, but completely, utterly disastrous from the point of view of biodiversity and loss of species. So we're in really a battle, and the battle is far from won. A bright moment in this battle, limited bright moment, because we've been there before, came in 2015. The reason is that when the governments met in 2012, well, you could even go back to 2009. We were supposed to reach a new climate treaty in Copenhagen in 2009, and the effort collapsed, you'll recall. And then in 2012, the governments met again in Rio on the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit and took stock of these 3 environmental treaties and realized that they were not functioning. So the government said, we need to do something more, and I think they came up with a clever idea. I hope it's to be tested, and that was to try to put the idea of sustainable development not only as a legal framework and a diplomatic and a scientific idea, but to put it in front of the broad public by adopting sustainable development goals that could come to be known by the world community more generally. So in September 2015, after 3 years of intergovernmental negotiation, the 193 member states of the UN adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I hope you know them. You better. You have to help lead them. This is very fragile, but my advice is we don't have too many levers to change course. And when you have global agreement on something, we had better do everything possible to try to make it work. So if you don't know all 17 Sustainable Development Goals by heart, go home and study them or look them online if my talk is very boring, so that you can memorize them by the end of my talk. And then go home and impress your kids, your friends, your parents, your colleagues, and make sure that they know them also, because we need a kind of chain letter worldwide for people to appreciate that we have a shared set of Sustainable Development Goals, and that they are our last chance, actually, to remain anywhere remotely within climate safety and to prevent the loss of millions of other species, because we're that close to disaster. We've wasted that much time that this is the last chance. The next 20 years is the remaining chance to stay within a climate even remotely like the climate of the Holocene. And we're already outside of the climate of the Holocene, or just about. With another ½ degree C increment of temperature, will be outside anything since the Eemian period, which was 130,000 years ago. And the Eemian period, the sea level was 8 meters higher than now, just to give you a little bit of parameterization. And the greenhouse gases are about to reach levels that have not been seen for millions of years on Earth. So we're really making a mess, and this is the last chance to get it under control. So my job at the UN is to help promote the Sustainable Development Goals and to do anything that I can think of to try to make them real, operational, in front of the public, political, objects of education at the universities, and especially objects of applied science and technology. Because the basic solution to these challenges actually is technological. So it's based on science and technology. I'm sorry to say it, it's not simply behavioral or waking up or good values. We have a real difficult problem, which is that there are 7.5 billion people on the planet. There will soon be 8 billion people on the planet in the early years of the 2020s. They all need safe water every day. They need food every day. They need access to public health protection from malaria or other killers every day. Their kids need to be in school. They need electricity. They need infrastructure so that they can participate in the world economy and have some foothold with livelihoods and jobs. And that is not a low-tech undertaking. That is a high-tech undertaking. That requires a tremendously sophisticated, global-scale infrastructure of, obviously, information systems, of power generation, of moving food globally, because this cannot be through national autarkic markets or local food. As nice as that sounds, we will not support 8 billion people in an autarkic way. We need a global economy that is based on the best we know of technology in every sphere: renewable energy, decarbonized energy sources, information technology to provide information services, knowledge platforms, smart systems, smart grids, advanced logistics, advanced payment systems, online ID for e-governance, because 8 billion is a lot of people, and there's not a chance of getting this right without the deployment of the best of the technologies. I'm sorry? And what? Oh, population? Yeah, so, yeah, on population, there is one absolutely central, easy, direct, overwhelming solution to the demographic challenge. And that's to let kids stay in school, at least through secondary level or beyond. It is the absolute most important way to get a demographic transition. If girls drop out at age 10 because there's no financing, no schools, no means, as they do in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, fertility rates will be 6 or 8 children per woman. This is simple. If girls are enabled to complete a high school education, which, as all of you know, is SDG number 4, right? Good. So SDG number 4 is universal secondary education completion. And if we achieve that, the fertility rate will fall below 3 within 10 years. And it will approach 2, the replacement rate, within 20 years. And the whole demographic path for Africa will change. Right now in the UN forecast, Africa's on a trajectory, sub-Saharan Africa's on a trajectory to reach 4 billion people by 2100. My advice to my friends in Africa is don't try that. In an era of climate change, where land holdings are already down to less than 1 hectare per household, this is a disaster underway. And so the right answer is keep the kids in school. Young women in school will become young women with gainful employment. Marriages will be later. Urbanization will be successful. And women with access to contraception and health care and education will have 2 children, not 6. And this is how development works. So there are answers to all of these things, and I beg the European governments every day, invest in African education. Are you kidding? Not just in the Coast Guard. If you invest in the Coast Guard, what's going to happen when there are 3 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa by mid-century, not 1 billion today? You think the migration problem is going to be any easier? No way. Invest in education. That's got to be the answer. And that, to my mind, is a small microcosm of a general principle. All of the Sustainable Development Goals, which you all know by heart now, are absolutely achievable. There's no fundamental barrier to ending poverty, resilient food supply, having all kids in school, having universal access to health coverage, having access to safe water and sanitation, having an energy system built on renewable energy, or basically zero carbon energy, let's say, which is what the world needs by mid-century. None of that is beyond reach, but all of it requires the application of best knowledge and advances in science, and especially advances in applied sciences and, well, not just applied sciences. We need deep climatological knowledge, obviously, but we also need a lot of applied knowledge of downscaling, climate forecasting, of risk assessment, of adaptation engineering, of best practice smart grids and smart renewable energy systems and the like. And so the challenge is to bring this knowledge to the forefront. As a basic strategy, I suggest to politicians, let the universities play a bigger role. This is smart for the economy, and it's smart for problem solving. And it really is the key to success, actually, because the universities are the natural homes for the universe of knowledge that is needed. Most of the knowledge that's needed is integrative knowledge, bridging across several disciplines, bringing to bear practical solutions to problems, and governments are not capable of this. Even well-meaning governments have to ask their leading scientists and engineers on the outside for help. And so I believe the role of universities in this is a very particular and special role. And that's why I recommended to Ban Ki-moon several years ago that he convoke a global network of universities that would work together across national boundaries on sustainable development, which is exactly what we're here to launch, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network for Greece in the next couple of days, and which is part of a worldwide effort for mobilizing knowledge. Now, let me say a word or two about open science in this context. How does it work and what does it mean? Actually, but one thing to say before I get there. Not only is science for sustainable development essential for survival, which is not a small matter, and for human well-being, which should count, as Aristotle taught us 2,300 years ago, but it's also good for the economy. Because if you ask the basic question, which economies are functioning well and which are not functioning well, the biggest single divide is whether the economy is generating scientific and technological innovation. That is the great divide. It's the great divide in Europe because Northern Europe is working well, high patenting, massive investments in research and development, a lot of innovations, and it's not working in Southern and Eastern Europe, where despite great scientific traditions, the level of research and development spending is much lower, the amount of patenting is much lower, and the innovations are not creating new startup businesses. And so this is really the big divide. And in the United States, this is our big divide also. California and the US Northeast are working beautifully. The economy is doing quite well. There's a huge amount of wealth being created, whether it's in Silicon Valley or in Kendall Square outside of, at MIT, because that's where the tech is being generated and the new businesses are being generated. But look at the big middle of the United States and the southern states, Trumpland, and things are not good. The jobs have left or they've been automated. The startups are very little, the patenting is very low. And interestingly, in the politics, if you rank Trump's vote by state, if you rank the states by the number of just bachelor's degrees per 25 to 29-year-olds or per adult population, for the top 19 states, the highest college university degrees, Hillary Clinton won 18 of those 19 states. And if you look at the bottom 32 states, Trump won 29 of those 32 states. So our country is divided by education, innovation, patenting, and that is just basic advice. If Greece wants to recover, spend more on science and technology. Create the innovation culture here. I mean, foster it. There's a lot already, but foster it. Greece's spending on R&D is about 1% of GDP. In Sweden, it's more than 4% of GDP now. In Korea, Israel, Sweden, the top investors. In the US, it's about 2.7% of GDP, but not evenly distributed geographically. So this is good business. It's core for economic development, but it's also absolutely vital for sustainable development. So let me come to a few scattered thoughts about open science in this context. How does open science relate to science for sustainable development? In some basic ways, absolutely essential, and I hope achievable in the not too distant future. So one example that I would ask you about, because you're leading this effort, when I log on to my Columbia University account each day, I have access to around 50,000 journals. I can find everything I need, and all references that I come across and the most recent postings are, of course, immediately available to me. The cost of that for adding another subscriber is basically zero. This is a zero marginal cost activity. If you go to an African university, they don't have access to any of that, or almost none of it. Maybe to the open access journals, but not to most of the journals. And of course, Columbia University pays a huge amount of money to gain access to those 50,000 journals, to make them available to people within the system. But one basic lesson of zero marginal cost economics is that you can segment the market and improve efficiency. So I ask a basic question: couldn't we make these 50,000 journals immediately available to students in low-income countries without doing too much damage to the business model of these journals? Because these journals don't sell anything in those countries to begin with. So for them, it's almost zero economic cost, or perhaps zero economic cost. And that's called market segmentation. And it was the trick that we used 15 years ago to start AIDS treatment in low-income countries, because AIDS drugs were very expensive, under patent in the rich countries, but the cost of producing them was tiny. I made the argument 15 years ago with others, well, keep them at high cost if you need to in the rich countries, but let poor people have them at production cost. And that's enabled 15 million people who are HIV infected to stay alive because of a market that is segmented. It's not ideal for the rich countries, but it's absolutely life-saving for the poor countries. So one aspect of open science is how to make open science that is available at almost or literally zero marginal cost available to the low-income world, which desperately wants and needs the collaboration, the knowledge, and the online access. That's a simple kind of argument that I think is absolutely real. Then it gets more complicated, and that is open science is one part of a solution to a general conundrum: how do we mobilize resources for science? This is a problem that goes back to ancient Greece and to Rome. Who pays for science? And the basic problem here is that science, which is knowledge, has this wonderful advantage over normal economic goods and services of being non-rival. And that is that knowledge is, once it's found, is available for all without diminishing access by anybody else. And the result of that is that the ability to spread knowledge for free or at low cost is present, but on the other hand, the ability to appropriate the economic gains from more knowledge is fraught with problems. What are the incentives to create scientific knowledge or technological knowledge if it's just going to be freely used? And so, as everybody knows, for hundreds of years we've been facing that problem, and one way is that kings and militaries and princes pay for science through patronage, or in the modern era through philanthropic gifts of Bill Gates or John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie. So that's one solution. And another, so you have the state paying for it, or you have private wealth holders paying for it. And the other solution is that you put a private property right to new knowledge in the patent system. And that, in a way, is the enemy of open science, or the counterpart of open science. But the positive of the patent system is it creates incentives for finding new knowledge. And the whole battle of public economics is how do you assess or how do you create a system that properly balances the open access and the need for incentives that are brought about through devices like the patent system. And there are many, many principles. I'm alerted that my time is up, but some principles, for example, are don't patent basic scientific knowledge. It would be crazy if every time you wanted to use Schrodinger's wave equation, you had to pay a royalty to the Schrodinger family. Or if you wanted to use E equals MC squared, you had to pay a royalty, but you could use E equals MC to the 1.9. You know, obviously this would not work. Or don't use pi, Pythagoras was there first, but you can use 3.14. That's open access. So this is a kind of battle, and one answer is that basic science should be open for free, and then we absolutely depend on the generosity of others, on the patronage, on the state, to properly finance that in the modern society, and on our own efforts of volunteering. But basically, we need state support for that. Then comes the question of the patents. And the patents are in principle for more downstream applications. And so in the United States, we increasingly left pharmaceutical development to patent protection. And we then have anomalies where a great discovery was made 10 years ago, but basically proved 5 years ago, to cure hepatitis C. Brilliant new drug and a brilliant new mechanism called sofosbuvir. And it's owned by a company, Gilead, which bought the patent to it. And the production cost of this cure for hepatitis C is about $100. It's $1 a pill for an 84-day course of treatment. And you know how much Gilead charges for it? $84,000. They charge a 1,000-time markup. Why do they do that? Because they own it. So they're killing Americans massively. And when I say you're killing Americans, they say, well, that's how the market system works. And obviously the market system doesn't work very well. It did work well enough to provide some of the financing for the development of the drug, though so did the US government, by the way, through NIH. Both private and public. But now you have millions of infected people who are unable to get treatment because it costs $84,000 and the public system doesn't support it except for very, very sick and dying people. So it's really a bizarre thing. So there are many principles that we could discuss, but I would say the following. First, patents do not work when we're looking after public goods, not private goods. So we need government financing all the way down the line on things like climate resilience, climate adaptation. Also, patents don't work very well when your basic goal is massive application of the new technology, because a patent gives a monopoly for 20 years. So it slows the uptake, even though it speeds the discovery, perhaps. So for that, we need public financing as well. We don't want all of the knowledge of renewable energy to be held by a few private companies. We want a massive deployment of low-cost renewable energy to be widely available right now. So we have to watch the monopoly side of this on many areas. Patents don't work when it's problems of very poor people. The first rule of markets is markets don't care about poor people. Markets care about money. They're brilliant at that. If a CEO says, I'm going to be in the business of poor people, sell your stock. Poor people can't pay. So we need public financing for addressing the challenges specifically for poor people, say malaria control or other tropical diseases, which we call neglected tropical diseases, except hundreds of millions of people are afflicted by them. So they're not neglected, they're just not solved because the market doesn't give the incentive to solve them. And then we have the special problems, I would say, of big data that have evolved in our new high data environment that we're living in, the Moore's Law world that we have. And I think that there are several different aspects of this challenge. One is that because of the advent of big data, the social gains from mass collaboration have increased tremendously. Both the ability and the benefits of collaboration have increased massively. And so the era of big data begs for mass collaboration to share data so that it can be used for machine learning and for deep analytics that are now possible that were not possible before. Say on the intricacies of short-run climate dynamics or downscaling climate change and so forth. But the paradox, of course, is that the big data is increasingly dominated by a few internet portals, by Google, by Amazon, by Apple, and others, because the network externalities are such that you end up with a Facebook with 2 billion users, and Facebook knows more about us than we know about us, because they're monitoring everything we do, and they're selling it to advertisers or to insurance companies or to others who want to know about us or to politicians. And the big data is therefore going through very limited portals over which we have no rights, and we don't really even understand in detail the business model of these giants and the threats that they pose as well. So, in summary, I think that we're in an era where, without question, I would advise any government to increase the level of research and development spending as a basic strategy of economic development, I would say a sine qua non, as well as a core part of solving the challenges of sustainable development. So increased public financing is essential. I would say that the opportunities and needs for opening up science to reach the poor and to address public goods is more urgent than ever, and the opportunities for benefits are greater than ever. And I would finally say we need overall a new economic model of financing in which the patent system is viewed as a highly flawed but still useful device, but one that needs to be put in a limited context where we are able to address public goods and global collaboration far more effectively, open up the knowledge and use the big data at our disposal to the global well-being. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Μπορείτε να μας φέρετε το μικρόφωνο? Ωραία. Thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. We will now open the floor to questions. How much time do we have for questions? Okay, about 10 minutes for questions. Yes, please. Please identify yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Pavlos Georgiadis. I'm an ethnobotanist and food systems researcher. Ed Wilson, in his latest book, is blasting against the Anthropocene worldview. And I think one of the biggest challenges for the scientific community is to convince itself to escape this worldview. Do you see a tendency towards open washing, like we saw greenwashing in the last decades from traditionally polluting, carbon-intensive sectors like big industrial agriculture, for example? And if so, how can we actually ensure that open science works towards deep decarbonization, achieving the SDGs, rather than towards open washing? Thanks.
Maybe take a few questions.
Okay. So we can take additional questions, and then Professor Sachs will respond to them, all of them together. Yes, please. Yes, at the very back. The woman at the very back? Yes, it's...
Thank you very much, Niamh Brennan, Trinity College in Dublin. And thank you very much, Professor Sachs. You said it's our last chance and that we need to accelerate the implementation of our technologies to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But you also said that you wish that more politicians would read Nature and Science. If you forgive me, that seems a little random and unlikely to happen. So my question is, what is the best way to get science into policy, as it seems to be our best chance? Should we, for example, start to build policy briefs into journal articles and to change them into something that is directed and very specifically implementable by policymakers? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Alexandra Frati and I'm a teacher. You mentioned, hello. Thank you. You mentioned a new economic model. Could you be more specific about it? Thank you.
Hello, is it on? Yeah, my name is Pablo de Castro. I'm from University of Strathclyde, Glasgow. Thanks for your inspiring talk. You mentioned market segmentation as a potential approach to solving the online access issue. Would this amount to subsidizing? And if it would, why are we so allergic to call it by its proper name, I wonder?
Okay, and if I may, one question for me. Interest rates have never been lower, and yet, although there is liquidity, we don't see investments, not in this country, not in Europe, not globally. Why? Where is the risk? Why are the businessmen not investing? Why are they not responding? Thank you.
Let me start out with the question about businesses greenwashing, claiming to do things that they're not really doing. We have wonderful ads of Chevron and Exxon about how they love the world and how they're looking for clean solutions, and they're portraying natural gas, for example, as the clean solution, even though natural gas is absolutely a major fundamental contributor to carbon emissions and is unacceptable at any significant scale in the future. I think the first thing to say about business is one can make a map of the actual business interests, and most businesses are either neutral or favorable to proper sustainable development practices. It's only a few sectors that are really a big problem, and the oil and gas industry, or oil, gas, and coal, is sector number one that is the biggest problem. So we can focus our attention on that sector. One of my goals is to make Exxon a tiny little company. You know, I don't really see much role for Exxon after the middle of the century. They see it a little differently. You know, from being, they're one of the most powerful, arrogant companies in the world. They even own the State Department now. And they don't understand why they need to disappear. And I'm telling them you don't have to disappear as long as you become a wind company. But oil and gas we're not going to need after the middle of the century. So I think that the key is focus, and keep our focus on the areas and the sectors that are doing the big damage. And the fossil fuel industry is by far the most powerful recalcitrant sector in the world economy. It's very powerful. It ran the show for the 20th century. How many wars were fought in the name of oil and gas? A lot. It's very important energy. Fortunately, we have alternatives now. But wind and solar and geothermal don't have the political clout as the incumbents. And that's where we need to keep attention. And then I would say the other major anthropogenic sector in the world is agriculture. And making sure that the big agriculture companies behave themselves and that their supply chains are sustainably managed is both necessary and feasible. And a very good behavior in this area is Unilever. And the CEO of Unilever, Paul Pullman, has been a real champion of sustainable development. And it's not greenwashing, it's very real and very significant. Of course, there are a lot of companies that are clear-cutting forests and doing a lot of damage. But we also have satellites now that can monitor this on a daily basis, actually. And so there are ways to focus attention on the main areas of difficulty. Then the second question was how to get more science into policy. And there, I was with the editor of Nature just last week talking about this. I want politicians to read Nature, so I actually am trying to propose ways that if you do read Nature weekly, pretty much the second half of the issue is impenetrable to me, at least most of the articles. But the first half, which they call the magazine, not the journal, is science policy, and it's absolutely wonderful, or summaries of the quantum computing articles in the second half where I can't understand them at all and don't know the notation. But the first half of the journal or the first half of the magazine each week is an incredible compendium of what we've learned during the week as well as features. And so I'm quite serious about trying to find ways, even to get my colleagues in the social sciences to read this, because the social sciences also have a very bad tradition of ignoring the engineering and the physical sciences. By the way, the physical sciences have a not great understanding of public policy as well. And so scientists publish an article and say, well, I've done it. Why aren't they listening? And that's the other part of the value chain that we need to get right. And I also just want to make a pitch. Aristotle actually made these distinctions also 2,300 years ago of pure knowledge, episteme, and practical knowledge, techne. So there's a big difference of engineering and the basic sciences. And I want to make a plea for engineers, by the way, because really the engineers are at the interface of great scientific understanding, but actually solving the problem. And so we need engineering, basically, as the most urgent challenge right now, and we need an engineering mentality also. The engineering mentality is, I'm going to find a way to get this done. And even if I have to patch it up and make prototypes and don't quite understand it, I'm going to get this done. And I think that that is absolutely a key part of the problem solving that we need. But I would also recommend that universities invite your politicians over. Really, get them to the university. Have a workshop on science and technology for sustainable development, science and technology for Greek competitiveness, and get the politicians in the door and help them to understand how vast the area that they don't know anything about really is and why they should care. They should care because it's going to create jobs, it's going to create prosperity, and it's going to save the country from disaster. So I want also the universities to take an active, promotive role in this. And I think that politicians are much more ready for this. Of course, as I told you, we have a dunderhead in the United States, so I'm not counting on Trump falling in love with scientific knowledge. We're just trying to safely get past this little detour as fast as possible. But most politicians kind of sense that they had better tap into this. Universities are often a bit shy on this also. They're not necessarily great at practical problem solving. And so getting the university engagement, so it's the basic scientists, the engineers, and the policy types together to work on these problems together with the politicians, I think is an important part of the story. Let me say a word about market segmentation and subsidization. There's a basic principle in economics about monopoly, which is that a price discriminating monopolist is more efficient than a single price monopolist. And what that means in the jargon is that if a monopolist sets one price for the product at the monopoly power, or if the monopolist sets multiple prices depending on different markets, the latter alternative is more efficient. And the vivid case of that is the one I gave of drug prices. If you set a high price in the rich market and the marginal cost of production of the drug in the poor market, the likely effect on your profits is precisely zero because there was no market in the poor country to begin with. So it's not even subsidization in that case. But what is true is that the R&D that was funded for the sake of rich people, quote unquote, spills over to the benefit of all people, even though those who aren't paying for it through a price marginal cost markup under patent protection. So market segmentation can be a way, yes, to make rich countries pay for their own well-being in ways that spill over to the benefits of poor countries. And I think it's a good model in general, and one thing that we should do because it's both efficient and equitable. And so we should be spending a lot more time asking, how do we get the benefits that our rich world economy, the OECD countries, are doing out of their own economic interest? How do we make sure that all those zero marginal cost spillovers are brought to the benefit of poor countries? This actually becomes even more important in a way because the poor countries are losing also in a certain important way in the world economy right now. It used to be, even 20 years ago, that the way to go from poverty to wealth was to do labor-intensive production and then over time improve your technology. So most poor countries started in cutting and stitching apparel, for example. And the sweatshop, so-called, in the poor countries were the stepping stones to more sophisticated work and higher tech over time. That's how Korea went from poverty to wealth, for example. But now those low-end jobs don't exist anymore because robots are doing them. And so the poor countries have an added difficulty right now, which is that the traditional low-end manufacturing is basically being automated away. And even in our own countries, jobs that were available for high school graduates now go to Baxter, the robot, because the robots are getting sufficiently good and the workflow systems are much better that you don't need low-skilled work. And that's a big burden. And it's a barrier to development now. And so we have to find added ways to make sure that poor countries can get a foothold in technology. And that means making a lot of this available for free, basically, as a spillover to help them have an information-intensive development. But it also requires mass education, as I was emphasizing before. The final question, there was a question about the new economic model for science and technology, and I don't have a good answer for that. I'm sorry? 1 minute. Okay.
Because of your schedule, not the...
Basic point for all countries. Make your government, urge your government to invest at least 2% of GDP in science and technology. That's the new guidelines for success. Because it used to be 0.1%, then 0.5%. But science and technology is so central for development now that the amount that's invested should be at least 2% of GDP by government. And hopefully you get to 4 or 5% of GDP with matching by the non-government sector. So that's a main point. But then there are lots of things which I don't have time to say and I don't even know about new institutional models for combining public and private investment in science and technology. Final point, why isn't there more investment? Several answers to that question. First, there is a lot of investment. It's in China, it's in Asia, it's in India, it's in our part of the world where the investment has slowed down. Second, there's a lot more investment than it seems because the price of computation has declined, so the investment in computational capacity, for example, accelerates, even if the outlays don't. So all the measurement issues are necessary to answer that question. But third, there's a lot of confusion. What is Europe's growth model? It doesn't exist right now. What is the US growth model? Save us from Trump. That's our model. We don't have a model right now. We're trying to survive. And then maybe we'll have a model in the future. So Europe needs a growth model. And that, by the way, one simple thing to do would be to connect the power grid with the smart grid from Athens to Munich so that Greece could sell geothermal, wind, and solar power to Germany, make a good living, clean up the environment, close down the lignite, and make everybody happy. Thank you.
I want to thank Professor Sachs for really making the effort and honoring us with his keynote and his presence in Open Science Fair. I also want to thank Professor Phoebe Koundouri, who is a professor of economic theory and econometrics at the Athens University of Business and Economics, the director of iCreate, a non-for-profit research center, and also one of the two leaders of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Greece, which will be launched tomorrow in the presence of Professor Sachs. Wherever you are in Greece, the rest of Europe, or the world, SDSN is something that we should all put in our portfolio of activities as scientists, policymakers, or whatever, I'm completely sold, and I collaborate a lot with Phoebe. So open science, sustainable growth, I think they are sisters, and we should move in that direction. Thank you very much again.